talk about our 3 takeaways. Maybe not as later as I thought. Darren, as you look at this past weekend of college football, what was your first takeaway?
Well, the first thing I have to mention, let me lower my head just a little bit to make sure that you see my hat. Oh, who is that on my hat? That is the team that's 2-0 and still atop the SEC. Just while I can say it, I wanted to point it out. It definitely looked like a better week this week for Vanderbilt than it did last week. The Hawaii game ended up being a little bit scarier than it should have been, but they played the way they should have this week, pulled away in the second half, and again, most importantly, 2-0, number one in the SEC. Just wanted to point that out. That's my first takeaway from the week. How about you? What's your first takeaway?
And I celebrate and rejoice with you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Even in my grief.
Even in your despair.
I'm not sure I can add much more to what Brian Kelly said at his press conference, but
oh yeah.
LSU is my first takeaway. And the takeaway is that they were in a game that they did not belong to. They did not belong in.
Right.
There was an eerie feeling, Darren, at the beginning when they could not punch it in from the 1-yard line.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was just a harbinger of the rest of the game. Now, there's a lot of commentary given about what happened. I think it goes to the coaches. What kind of scheme were they running where Harold Perkins is virtually taken out of rushing the passer?
Yeah.
And he's dropping back in coverage, 23 plus times or more than that. He's only rushing the passer 7 times. Now, Florida State is an outstanding football team. I look for them to win the ACC this year. They are solid, and frankly, they pushed LSU around in the trenches.
Yeah.
That surprised me. I didn't think offensive line would be a weakness for LSU, but they got pushed around in that game. And I'm also very concerned about their secondary, Darren.
Yes.
That's going to be a huge problem this coming year. And so there's so many issues there, but the big one for me was, LSU did not look like they belonged on the field with Florida State in the second half.
Right.
And, you look at how Florida seemed so ill prepared against Utah. At least LSU didn't have all the penalties, but still the effort wasn't there. The execution wasn't there. And then I look at, we were talking about Colorado, what Deion Sanders did down there, and it's just amazing. And so, last week I said, Darren, that Brian Kelly was starting to win me over. I think I'm back to how I felt when they first announced he was hired as the coach for LSU.
Yeah. Well, but I will say this for him, at least he owned it in the press conference. He didn't come in and make a bunch of excuses and say, well, if this would have happened and that would have, we just stunk. I mean, so I give him that. I applaud the fact that in this day and age and the way a lot of coaches approach things, he owned it. He did completely and totally. So I give him that.
There's no easy way to deal with that when you get embarrassed on national TV. But I think some of the criticism of Jaden Daniels is unfair. I think he played overall a pretty good game. Receivers dropped some balls. Of course, he missed some reads. Every quarterback is going to miss some reads. But my big concern is with the coaching staff. And as you said, Brian Kelly took responsibility for that. But but I got to say, Coach Kelly, you've got to stop doing this. You've got to stop dragging my heart around. Okay, you just come on, man. That was my first takeaway.
All right, you got to give me a heads up when you're going to do that. I'm panicking, looking at my computer screen like, what video has started playing?
Just a little Stevie Nicks and Tom Petty.
You can't go wrong with that. I mean,
we all choose the ways we're going to self-medicate after a devastating loss. And
that's right. Yours is Tom Petty.
Well, I'll go ahead and give my second takeaway for the week. And that is a press conference from the Indiana head football coach, Tom Allen. Now, they lost to Ohio State, as they typically do. And what a tough job. I watched I watched a little bit of that, Darren. They didn't even fill their stands. They were hosting Ohio State, and they did not even fill
No.
their stands. But one thing that caught my attention about Tom Allen, I know we don't cover the Big Ten much; it's out of our purview. But his press conference, he was talking about his upcoming game against Indiana State, which is this coming Friday. Now, exactly. I have a very strong position on this.
Yes, you do. We as a podcast do.
Friday nights are meant for high school football. So imagine my joy when I heard Tom Allen talk about his game Friday night and say the Big Ten scheduled this. We as a university did not, or an athletic program, we did not. That's out of our control. And he said, well, go ahead and play the clip of what he said.
Let's see what he has to say.
And really dive into those. And there's no off day this week. Monday's usually our off day. We'll practice on Monday because of our Friday games. So, but you know how I feel about Friday night games. That's not a decision that we make. That comes straight from the Big Ten. So anybody wants to complain about that, don't talk to me. Okay. And so that's Friday night football is for high school football. Bottom line. I'll say it till I'm blue in the face, until somebody tells me to shut up. So, and I'll probably say it again. Friday night football is for high school football.
Say it again, Coach. Say it again.
He is speaking your language, isn't he?
I don't know anything about Tom Allen. I know very little about Indiana football, but that's a man after my heart right there.
I was to say, he very quickly became one of your top 5 favorite coaches, didn't he?
way to call out the Big Ten and other conferences who are getting so greedy for those dollars and for that television coverage that, come on, man. Come on. What is more American than Friday night high school football?
Yep. I agree completely.
How about your second takeaway?
Well, since you said getting tired of those schools that are the big schools being greedy, I'll just kind of piggyback off of that. And that'll be my second takeaway. And that is the games we watched this weekend. And I'm not even going to get outside of the SEC. Like you said, that's kind of outside of our lane, at least where we are right now. But when you look at the SEC games this weekend, when an SEC team won, the average margin of victory was 41 points. That's not a ball game. And we've talked about this before. And honestly, I think we get a little bit more upset about the games in November that are like this than the ones in September. But I get it. I get the fact that you have to have tune-up games, that there needs to be some preseason games, the equivalent of preseason games. But my thing is, let's start acting that way. That's my second takeaway from this past week. Let's call it what it is. It is every one of these games, unless you are an LSU that schedules a Florida State, unless you are an Alabama that this coming week is scheduling Texas, and we'll talk about that later. And I know have been some other games that were bigger games like this, and there's going to be some more this coming week. And as we get closer to the conference schedule, it'll be more and more like that. But if you have a game that's in the month of September and you're going to beat somebody by 75 points or 65 points or whatever it is, the stuff we saw this weekend, why not treat it like what it is and just say these are tune-up games, the equivalent of an NFL preseason game. We're not going to ask season ticket holders to pay for these games. What we're going to do going forward is we acknowledge here's the 2 or 3 games during this season that most likely are going to be blowouts. And we're not going to include these in season ticket packages. But what we're going to do is we're going to open it up to the general public. They'll go on sale week before the game, 2 weeks before the game, whatever it is. And it's $25 a pop, whatever it is. Let these be games that people who aren't going to be season ticket holders, if you're at Alabama or if you're at Tennessee, places like that, LSU, where people have to buy tickets at a higher price from a third party to be able to get into a game because everything is sold out for the most part. Give this as an opportunity to give your fan base that's not going to be season ticket holders an opportunity to get in the game, to see a game maybe once a year, maybe once every 5 years. But either way, it's giving that opportunity for a family of 4, pay $100, get in the gate and see a game that they otherwise might not have an opportunity to do. Let's acknowledge it for what it is and use it as an opportunity to reach out to the rest of the fan base. And if you're a Vanderbilt, do the exact same thing as hopefully an opportunity to build a fan base. that a family of 4 does get to come and see a game, and there's 2 kids, 2 kids, 3 kids, whatever, they're going to see a football game that haven't gotten to see one yet, and they're there, and that increases your opportunity of making a fan on that day. To me, this makes a whole lot more sense than forcing season ticket holders to pay 50 and $60 a game to watch somebody get beat 73-7 and leave at halftime because the game's over with. If you give that opportunity, like we're talking about, those people are going to be there when the game starts and probably stay till the game ends because it's the only game they're going to see this year or for the next, like I said, 3 years, 5 years, or whatever. To me, that makes a whole lot more sense than trying to treat these games as something other than what they are.
Great idea, Darren. I can get behind that 100%. The flip side of that, as you mentioned, the tune-up game, the flip side is what happens to LSU. What's happened to LSU,
exactly.
the last 4 years?
Yep.
You take on a heavyweight to open up the season, you risk a loss and you risk being humiliated. And that's tough, especially when you're the only game on at that time.
Yep. And I think the one thing I will say is tune-up game, preseason game, whatever you want to call it, what happened to LSU this past weekend does give some validity to, even if your big game is going to be Florida State, the second game, maybe you do need to, if you're LSU, play,
Grambling.
Exactly. Maybe flip those two. Grambling is week 1. Florida State is week 2. Maybe that makes a little bit more sense to get some of the kinks and the rust off before you go rolling into Orlando, Tallahassee, wherever.
Mm-hmm. Great points. What about your third takeaway, Darren?
All right. My third one is Tez Walker. And again, because it's not in the SEC, people might not be overly familiar. But I actually saw a lot of Twitter activity about this weekend. It really stuck to me. Tez Walker stuck with me. Tez Walker is at North Carolina and has applied for eligibility because he's transferred twice. He first started out at North Carolina, I believe it was North Carolina State, went there in 2020, did not play a game because North Carolina State, because of the pandemic, canceled their season. So he never played a game as a member of the North Carolina State football team. Then he transferred to Kent State, had some family issues going on at home. He's from the Charlotte, North Carolina, that central North Carolina area that involved his grandmother, chose to come home. North Carolina offered him a scholarship, and he now is on the team at North Carolina. That circumstance has not only been denied eligibility by the NCAA, but has been denied eligibility by an appeal board. It now has to go through a third process. The schools, Kent State and North Carolina State, that he transferred from, have written letters saying everything he says, the circumstances, everything, this is all legit. We were on board. We were happy to help him. This is something the NCAA that should be a no-brainer. And because he transferred, because 3 days after he transferred, the rule went into effect limiting the exemptions for a second transfer. He's had to fight this fight and has not been able to play yet this year, was not able to play in the first game. This is the ridiculousness of the NCAA in its purest form. There is no hiding behind how ridiculous this is from the NCAA perspective. This is a no-brainer that should be easily resolved, and it still hasn't been. He's in the process of having to put together a third appeal. Just absolutely ridiculous. When I read the story, my mind was blown that this is still, in everything that goes on in the NCAA right now, this is still something that's going on. That's just amazing to me.
And despite the support of coaches and the schools he was at and prominent sports personalities, it appears the NCAA has just dug in its heels and they're not bending.
Yep. And that's just unreal to me. It really does blow my mind that with everything else that you've got going on that's legal, air quotes, that's legal now, this is something that we're going to draw a line in the sand over. Just mind blowing. Really, really, really unfortunate. And looks bad in every way possible in the NCAA.
Yeah. It does. It does.
Now, what's your third takeaway?
Well, I'm going to highlight Texas State.
Oh, yeah.
What an incredible upset at Baylor. They travel up to Waco, pull off a huge upset. And the reason I want to talk about Texas State is because there's a former SEC quarterback that started for them. TJ Finley, remember him?
Absolutely, yeah.
Kid out of Ponchatoula, Louisiana,
Yep.
originally went to LSU, then transferred to Auburn. Now he's at
Yep.
Texas State. All he did was throw for 298 yards, 3 touchdowns, rush for another one, and lead Texas State to its first win over a Power 5 opponent ever.
Man, that's awesome.
Outstanding.
That's awesome.
Sometimes players need a new place. They need a new environment.
Yep.
And I'm always happy when it doesn't work out for a player, they get a new opportunity, and he made the most of that opportunity. So congratulations to TJ Finley.
Absolutely. That's awesome.